A poison older than kings. Prologue, the Hollow Hour. The hour before dawn has no name in the Maker's calendar. The priests of Solenmere do not pray in it. The auric veil does not march in it. It exists between the last candle and the first gray light like a held breath, and in that breath, if you are very still, the old world speaks. The vision did not come to Lord Aldric Vayne the way holy men described visions in the Maker's texts. There was no golden light, no voice like rolling water, no warmth that spread from the chest outward until the body felt like a vessel filled with something greater than blood. It came the way winter came to the high passes of Valdrek, without announcement, without mercy, without any concern for whether you were ready. He was sitting in the high-backed chair beside the dead fire in his solar, a cup of wine untouched on the table beside him, his eyes open. He remembered that clearly afterward. His eyes were open. He had not been sleeping. He was simply sitting in the dark, the way a man sits when the noise of the day has finally exhausted itself, and there is nothing left between him and his own thoughts. And then the room was gone. Not darkness, not sleep, something older than either. He stood, or something that was him stood, because he could feel the cold of the stone through the soles of his boots, and that seemed important, that detail, the realness of the cold, in a hall he did not recognize. The ceiling rose beyond the reach of the torchlight into blackness. The walls were dressed stone, old enough that the mortar between the blocks had gone the color of ash. Banners hung from iron poles along the length of the hall, but their colors were wrong. Not wrong in the way a dye fades, but wrong in the way a word is wrong when you have stared at it too long. He knew those colors. He almost knew those colors. At the far end of the hall, elevated on 3 broad steps of dark granite, sat a throne. He had seen the throne of Thornvale twice in his life. Once, as a boy of 9, presented to the old King Vaelthor II at his father's side, too young to understand what he was looking at, but old enough to feel the weight of it press against his sternum like a hand. Once as a man of 30, petitioning for the border rights that Vaelthor III had then spent 4 years slowly eroding through careful administrative silence. This was not that throne. This throne was older. The stone was the same dark granite as the steps, but the seat had been worn smooth by centuries of use, and the arms bore carvings that Aldric did not have the learning to read, not the Maker's script, not the trade tongue of the southern ports, not anything a living scholar would recognize. They moved in the torchlight, or seemed to. On the seat, barely visible, barely there, the ghost of a shape, a man's shape, large across the shoulders, still. Aldric took 1 step toward it. The shape turned its head. He did not see its face. He understood, with the particular clarity that belongs only to dreams and to moments just before death, that he was not meant to see its face. Not yet. The face was a thing to be earned. But it spoke. Not in words, not precisely. What entered him was more like the memory of words, the way you sometimes wake from sleep certain someone called your name, but the sound itself is already gone. What remained after the vision broke was not a sentence, but an understanding, and the understanding settled into his bones like marrow. The seat remembers. What poured into it first does not empty. The stone knows whose blood warmed it. And blood does not forget its throne. And beneath that, quieter, the way a blade is quiet in its sheath. The king holds a secret in the vault of his keeping. It will not go into the ground with him. Find it before the false morning breaks, or lose it to the dark forever. Then the hall was gone, and Aldric Vayne was in his solar again, the dead fire gray before him, the wine untouched, his eyes open. His hands were shaking. In 41 years of life, he had never once trembled. He looked at his hands for a long moment in the dark, these broad, scarred, capable hands that had managed estates and broken men and signed documents that quietly reshaped the lives of thousands, and he made a decision so quietly that he did not even say it aloud to the empty room. He would have that throne, whatever it cost, whatever the king was hiding. Whatever walked these old halls in the hollow hour and whispered into the ears of men with the right blood in their veins, he would answer it. He reached for the wine, drank, set the cup down, and began to plan. 3 weeks, 2 days, and 1 hollow hour later, King Vaythor III was dead. The guard posted at the base of the king's tower was a man named Aldric Vayne, 22 years old, second son of a minor house in Dunharra's eastern reach, proud of his posting in the way only young men who have not yet seen the inside of real violence can be proud. He had stood this post 41 times before this night. He knew the sound of the tower. He knew the way the wind came through the gap in the western wall and made the torch gutters flutter in a rhythm almost like breathing. He knew the creak of the third stair, the smell of the tallow candles the king's steward ordered from a chandler in Greyhaven, because Vaythor had specific opinions about smoke. He knew this tower, which was why, when something changed, he felt it before he understood it. It was not a sound. It was the absence of one. The king kept a body servant, an old man named Proctor, who had been with Vaythor since before the crown, who slept on a pallet outside the royal chamber door, and whose snoring was, according to every guard who had ever held this post, audible from the base of the stairs on a quiet night. The tower was quiet. Proctor was not snoring. Aldric Vayne stood very still and listened to that silence, and felt the skin along his forearms go tight beneath his gambeson. He told himself it was nothing. Old men slept deeply. Old men had nights when the snoring stopped. He told himself this for approximately 30 seconds before his feet began moving up the stairs without having consulted the rest of him. He found Proctor sitting against the wall outside the chamber door. Not slumped, sitting. Upright, almost dignified, his chin dropped to his chest, his hands open in his lap. His color was wrong, the particular gray that Edwic's grandmother had gone in her final sleep. But his chest moved, barely. A shallow tide. Alive then. Deeply, wrongly, inexplicably asleep. The chamber door was closed. Aldric put his hand on it. The iron handle was cold, colder than the stone around it, colder than the night air, cold in a way that moved up through his palm and into his wrist like a current running the wrong direction. He pushed the door open. The king's chamber smelled of beeswax and old wool and something else, something beneath those familiar smells that Aldric had no name for, thin and sharp and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. The king was in his bed. The canopy was drawn back on the left side. One arm lay outside the covers, pale and still against the dark fur of the blanket. His face, turned slightly toward the door, wore an expression that Aldric would spend the rest of his life trying to describe accurately and never quite manage. Not peace, not fear, something between the two. The face of a man interrupted mid-thought by something that did not allow for the completion of thoughts. On the small table beside the bed, the table that held the king's nightly wine, his seal, the worn copy of maritime law he had been reading in small increments for the past 6 years, sat a cup. And from the cup came the smell. Thin, sharp, faintly sweet. Aldric Vayne, second son of a minor house, 22 years old and not yet broken by real violence, did 3 things in rapid succession. He checked that the king was not breathing. He confirmed that the king was not breathing. And then he opened his mouth and screamed for the guard in a voice that cracked on the second word and did not recover. By the time the court physicians arrived, someone had already identified the smell in the cup. Thornwood compound, ancient, outlawed for 2 centuries, a poison that belonged to the old world, to the time before the Maker's calendar, before the Auric Veil, before any living memory. A poison that should not exist in any kitchen, any apothecary, any lord's cabinet within 500 leagues of Thornvale. A poison, as the oldest physician present noted in a voice carefully emptied of implication, that could only have been prepared by someone who knew the deep forest. The old forest. The Thornwood. Within the hour, the accusation was already moving through the castle's corridors like smoke, formless, directionless, finding every gap and seam. Within the day, it would have a shape. Within the week, it would have a name. And somewhere, in a room Edwick Crane had not thought to search, because it was not a room he knew existed, because the king had been very careful for 30 years about what he allowed other people to know, something was missing. Something the king had kept. Something a dead man could no longer protect. The throne of Thornvale stood empty. The poison was older than kings. And whatever had truly walked out of that chamber in the hollow hour between the last candle and the first gray light had not left through the door. This has been a production of Theater of the Mind. A Poison Older Than Kings was developed and written in collaboration with Claude, an AI by Anthropic. Creative direction, characters, and world by Theater of the Mind. World building rooted in the Aethermoor universe, an original creation. Voice production by 11 Labs. All characters are original fictional creations. No real persons are represented. Theater of the Mind. The story lives here.